Hello and welcome to Indus News Live from Islamabad. I'm Hira Mustafa and these are the headlines. US President Joe Biden has defended its decision to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan, terming it the best available option. In a national address, Biden said the era of US military deployments to rebuild other nations has ended. Meanwhile, EU's Council President Charles Michel says Afghanistan crisis show that the bloc must strive for greater strategic autonomy. Policy Chief Joseph Borrell also decreed that the EU and the US were united in Afghanistan, but withdrawal timing and nature were set in Washington. Iran's Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian says Tehran will not accept retraction of talks with the US to revive the 2015 nuclear deal. Amir-Abdollahian said Tehran is not skipping the negotiating table, but Washington must speak respectfully to Iran. The seventh round of the talks were halted for the presidential elections and subsequent change of administration in Iran. The Arab coalition says it has intercepted 3 explosive-laden drones in Yemeni airspace launched by the Houthi rebels. Coalition spokesperson General Turki al-Maliki said Houthis are deliberately targeting populated areas and civilian infrastructure. This comes just a day after 8 people were injured when a Houthi drone targeting the Aba International Airport was intercepted. The World Health Organization says it is monitoring a new coronavirus variant known as MU, having mutations that indicate a risk of resistance to vaccines. In Brazil, the COVID-19 infections have spiked sharply again as it logged over 800 new fatalities and over 24,000 cases overnight. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, 101 more people lost their lives to the virus and over 3,500 tested positive in the last 24 hours. Globally, the infections tally has exceeded 217 million, with a death toll of over 4.5 million. Well, those were the headlines. News in detail coming after the short break. Stay with us. Well, those were the headlines. News in detail coming after the short break. Now the news in detail. U.S. President Joe Biden has defended his decision to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan, terming it the best available option. In a national address, Biden said the era of U.S. military deployments to rebuild other nations has ended. This report has the details.
As Taliban supporters paraded coffins draped with American, British, French and NATO flags in the mock funeral to mark the humiliating defeat of the West in Afghanistan, President Biden said U.S. pullout from the country has been an extraordinary success. He said the onus of unassailable Taliban gains in the country lies with President Ashraf Ghani government's inability to fight back. The president said Washington achieved its war aims in Afghanistan that it set initially, but he further noted U.S. armed forces are not done with ISIS-K, as he indicated unforgiving and targeted strategy against the terror group. He also called ISIS-K sworn enemies of the Taliban.
I simply do not believe that the safety and security of America is enhanced by continuing to deploy thousands of American troops and spending billions of dollars a year in Afghanistan. But I also know that the threat from terrorism continues in its pernicious and evil nature. But it's changed, expanded to other countries. Our strategy has to change too.
Meanwhile, the question of the future of the Taliban as legitimate actors in international politics remains unanswered. The Taliban welcomed foreign investment in Afghanistan, saying the new government will seek equal and friendly ties with other countries. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said imposing sanctions on Afghanistan's cash-strapped Taliban depends on the group's behavior. However, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas said there's no way around talks with the Taliban.
Ich persönlich glaube,
Personally, I believe there is absolutely no way around talks with the Taliban. For one, because we need to solve practical things such as keeping the airport open, and also because we can definitely not afford instability in Afghanistan, because that would favor terrorism and it would have consequences on Afghanistan's neighboring countries.
Qatar also warned that isolating the Taliban could lead to further instability and urged countries to engage with the movement. The UK government said it is in talks with the group to secure safe passage out of Afghanistan, while US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Washington will hold the Taliban accountable for the commitment of not letting Afghanistan be used against the US.
The European Union says Afghanistan's scenario shows that the bloc must strive for greater strategic and decision-making autonomy. EU Council President Charles Michel says the bloc must take action to be better prepared for military evacuations if and when needed. Earlier, Policy Chief Joseph Borrell also described that the EU and the US were united in Afghanistan, but withdrawal timing and nature were set in Washington. In an article, Borrell said the evacuation from Afghanistan is a wake-up call for Brussels and that it must build its own strategic abilities. He said the Europeans found themselves depending on American decisions in Afghanistan. He noted that a more strategically autonomous and militarily capable EU would be better able to address the challenges. The policy chief said the events in Afghanistan should lead to deepening the Atlantic alliance. For more on this, we have with us Lieutenant General retired Talat Masood. Sir, thank you for your time. Mr. Masood, President Joe Biden made a forceful defense of his decision to leave Afghanistan, telling Americans he refuses to send another generation to fight in a forever war. Why did the U.S. prolong this war so long and now make an abrupt pullout?
Well, I think President Biden obviously was defending his decision to adhere to the withdrawal timelines. And he did not mention much about the chaotic disorder that accompanied it. So I think he was just trying to say that whatever the mission was and of the U.S. in getting involved in Afghanistan was already fulfilled. And so, and I don't think he really elaborated on that mission, except to say that, you know, it was meant to kill Osama bin Laden, and that they succeeded. So I think their mission of having an inclusive government in Afghanistan, and also having a modern Afghanistan and trying to sort of build a completely different sort of Afghanistan altogether. People, you cannot transform a country by someone else. It has to come intrinsically. It has to come through the education of the people, through their understanding of how the world functions, what are their national requirements. I think that was completely ignored. And then, of course, U.S. and the Western world sort of targeted a very selective sort of an approach in the sense that they developed a certain class in cities. No doubt that they were able to transform them, give them good education, health facilities, and exposure to the world. But the rest of the country remained as backward as ever, or under the influence of forces like Taliban. So the Taliban had to return in that sense, and you saw what happened.
Right. Mr. Masood, President Biden has blamed Ashraf Ghani's government for unassailable Taliban's takeover. Should the previous Afghan government be only held responsible for this defeat, or the U.S. hasty withdrawal was also the main reason?
Well, I think it's a combination of both, but the fact is that the previous Afghan government was really not a people's government in that sense, that it did not have the support, and it was relying heavily on the U.S. And external support of the Western world. So I think that has to be realized, and they did not transform, Afghanistan fundamentally. And then I think there is also a very major lesson to be learned, that you cannot have another country transform people, of another country. It has to come from within. And the leadership has to be thrown from within. You cannot impose leadership by outside forces and expect that there would be a change. So there were certain fundamental flaws in the whole approach of the Americans. And then they came out with a very ambitious plan initially, saying that, they will transform the attitude of the Afghans towards women, which was a good thing, but it can't come by imposing a will on them. It has to come from within, through education, through exposure to the foreign world, through understanding the benefits of education for women as to how it will really transform the generations in Afghanistan. All that was not done, and it was also, again, very selective. And then Afghanistan was a very sort of a traditional and an old society. And so that also was a great disadvantage. Then the neighborhood was also very turbulent. So there are several factors, I think, which were responsible for what all happened.
Right. Mr. Masood, now the U.S. says that the Taliban will have to earn their legitimacy and support by meeting their commitments and obligations. Do you think the Taliban will be able to gain support of the international community in near future?
Well, I think much would depend how they conduct themselves. If they really take care of, if they do not go after their opponents in the way that, they did last time. And if they really conduct in a way which brings about greater cohesion and unity amongst the Afghans, I think that would be rewarded by the international community. But the international community is very closely watching their commitments and their words, their statements are matched with their performance and with their policies. So I think that would be very important for the Afghan leadership to ensure that they really conduct themselves in a way which harmonizes with what the world expects of any country, and especially a country which is under close scrutiny.
Right. Mr. Masood, fighting between Afghanistan's resistance forces and the Taliban fighters is reportedly raging on various regions of the Panjshir, Parwan and Baghlan provinces. Can the unrest spread to more provinces, and whether the Taliban are able to contain this?
Well, I think they will be able to overcome the resistance eventually, although I think in Panjshir they are having very serious opposition. And the Tajiks, a certain group amongst Tajiks is very much opposed to them, which is under, the former Masood's party. So I think there will be resistance from there, but ultimately they will have to, it will be overcome. And what I feel is, what is important is that they should seek a political solution to all these problems. They should work for a political inclusion of all these groups rather than use your military force alone in order to overwhelm them and to subjugate them. Because you can't treat your own people as subjects. You have to treat them as equals. And you do not give them an opportunity to express, a different viewpoint and so on. So I think all these things would matter eventually for the peace and stability of Afghanistan.
Lieutenant General retired Talat Masood, thank you for speaking to Indus News. And now we're moving on. Iran's new foreign minister says Tehran will not accept retraction in talks with the U.S. over the revival of the nuclear deal. The minister Hussein Amir Abdul Ayhan said negotiation for the sake of negotiation is not Iran's policy for protecting its interests. Amir Abdul Ayhan made these remarks in a phone call with his Croatian counterpart. He said the U.S. should know that it can only speak to the Iranian people with respect. The minister said it will take 2 to 3 months before the new administration in Iran settles down and starts planning. But he added that Tehran is not skipping the negotiating table. The EU has stressed the need for a resumption of Vienna talks, but no specific timetable has been set by the parties involved. The Arab coalition says it has intercepted 3 explosive-laden drones in Yemeni airspace launched by the Houthi rebels. Coalition spokesperson General Turki al-Maliki said Houthis are deliberately targeting populated areas and civilian infrastructure. This comes just a day after 8 people were injured when a drone targeting the Aba International Airport was intercepted. Earlier, Pakistan and the U.S. condemned the strike on Aba Airport. In a statement, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said these attacks endanger Saudis as well as over 70,000 U.S. citizens residing in the country. Blinken called on Houthis to uphold the ceasefire agreement and engage in peace negotiations. Israeli forces have martyred another Palestinian in the occupied West Bank city of Ramallah. Witnesses say the occupation troops opened fire at 39-year-old Raj Jadala and left him to bleed to death. They said the Palestinian laborer was crossing military-controlled area when the soldiers opened fire. This is the 3rd such Palestinian fatality at the hands of Israeli forces in less than a week. Meanwhile, in Gaza, Israeli forces attacked anti-blockade protesters, wounding 3 with live bullets. Palestinian media said the troops fired live rounds and high-velocity gas bombs at protesters near the border fence. It said dozens of them suffered the effects of tear gas inhalation in addition to cuts and bruises. South Korea says the U.S. is working closely with it to bring North Korea back to the dialogue table. The country's nuclear envoy, No Kyu-dak, made the remarks after a meeting with his American counterpart in Washington. No said the U.S. remains firmly committed to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula through diplomacy. He said Washington maintains a forward-looking, creative and flexible stance towards restarting the dialogue. Earlier, the White House said the U.S. is open to dialogue anywhere and anytime without preconditions. Last week, the two sides also discussed possible humanitarian assistance for the North to bring it back to talks. Ukraine has called its defense agreement with the U.S. as a new stage in their bilateral cooperation. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made these remarks in a tweet while on his visit to the U.S. He hailed the U.S. support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, gaining NATO membership, and opposition to Russian aggression. Earlier, the two sides signed the agreements in the field of research, development, testing, and evaluation of weapons. Washington has also promised Kiev up to $60 million in military aid to counter Moscow's military aggression. Zelensky is scheduled to meet President Joe Biden at the White House today. More news stories coming up after the short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. The World Health Organization says it is monitoring a new coronavirus variant known as MU. The health body says the variant has mutations that indicate a risk of resistance to vaccines. More in this report.
With a slower vaccine pace in developing and underdeveloped countries, controlling the pandemic has already been difficult. While the new variants complicate the efforts, the World Health Body has classified MU, which was first identified in Colombia in January, a variant of interest, saying it has the potential properties of immune escape. Meanwhile, globally, the infections tally has exceeded 217 million, with a death toll of over 4.5 million. The U.S. State Department has raised a travel advisory alert for Canada, while Idaho reactivated the National Guard to help hospitals overwhelmed with unvaccinated patients. Brazil, one of the worst-hit ones, has logged over 800 new fatalities and more than 24,000 cases overnight. Brazilian researchers have found that a molecule in the venom of a type of snake inhibited coronavirus reproduction in monkey cells. This is a possible first step towards a drug to combat the virus causing COVID-19.
We were able to see that the peptides not only inhibited the development of the virus in vitro inside the cell, but we were also able to see here in Sao Carlos that it was able to inhibit one of the proteins that is very important for the development of the virus and the propagation of new viruses.
The European Union has announced to fully vaccinate 70% of all adults across the 27-country bloc. Meanwhile, the French authorities said they aim to administer the third shot of a vaccine to some 18 million people by early 2022. New Zealanders ventured out as tough lockdown measures were eased for most of the country. However, Australia's Victoria state recorded a jump in new local cases, while the lockdown in Melbourne has been extended for another 3 weeks.
And when we hit the 80% double dose number, which we anticipate will be in November, New South Wales looks forward to having our citizens enjoy international travel. And also, New South Wales looks forward to stepping up and welcoming thousands of Australians home.
As cases continue to surge across the Philippines, prison officials said efforts are underway to inoculate thousands of inmates. In Thailand, opposition threatened to intensify street protests fueled by frustration at the government's handling of the virus outbreak.
In Pakistan, coronavirus has claimed another 101 lives over the past 24 hours. The Health Ministry says the death tally has trimmed to 25,889. The ministry registered over 3,500 new cases with an overnight positivity rate of 6.63%. Pakistan's caseload has exceeded 1.16 million, while more than 1,043,000 have recovered. The ministry said there are nearly 94,000 active cases, of which 5,690 are critical. The authorities have administered more than 55 million shots so far, and close to 17 million people are now fully vaccinated. The U.S. has condemned the Syrian army's assaults on opposition forces in the Daraa al-Balad province. In a tweet, U.S. Embassy in Syria said the attack killed civilians, displaced thousands, and led to food and medicine shortages. Washington called for an immediate ceasefire and unimpeded access for the UN and humanitarian agencies. This comes amid reports that the Syrian army stepped up an offensive against the opposition forces in Daraa. In the U.S., the Wildfire has forced thousands of more people to evacuate from California's Sierra Nevada mountain range. High winds threaten to whip up the flames as firefighters try to stop them from reaching the resort city of Lake Tahoe. The blaze, burning since mid-August, has charred over 191,000 acres of drought-parched forest so far. More than 6,800 large and small wildfires have burned an estimated 1.7 million acres of forest in California this season. Meanwhile, researchers say the cost of the worsening extreme on the U.S. could spike as high as $500 billion by 2050. They say the country could also suffer 59,000 heat deaths annually by that time. An elephant in Sri Lanka has given birth to twins for the first time in nearly 80 years. Wildlife authorities say the twins are both males and were born to Sarangi at Penavala Elephant Orphanage. The facility spokesperson said their father Pandu is also an orphanage resident. Sri Lankan elephant experts said twins were last born to a domesticated elephant in the country in 1941. Penavala was set up in 1975 to care for wild elephants that needed to be rescued or treated for injuries. It is one of Sri Lanka's biggest tourist attractions. In Peru, people displayed their creativity with recycled material in a mini car contest in Lima. More about the race in this report.
In an unlikely crossover, Dragon Ball's Goku defeated the Flintstones in a crazy car race. The event in Lima's San Miguel municipality saw contestants race in homemade cars built from recycled materials. San Miguel Mayor Jose Guevara lauded the involvement of families, children and parents in the contest.
Families, children and parents show their creativity in this crazy car contest. We saw the winning Dragon Ball car. They were producing smoke. I don't know how they came up with those effects. There was a lot of creativity.
The citizens enthusiastically participated in the event. The overall winners were three friends who built a car inspired by the Dragon Ball animation.
We gave it our souls, our hearts and life. And it's incredible we built this car in a couple of days. And here's the result of the union between three friends.
Second and third place were taken by Flintstones and Fast and Furious themed cars.
European stocks have advanced after Eurozone inflation data rattled market sentiment in the region. Investors are focused on U.S. non-farm payrolls data of August, which is scheduled to be released later this week. Paris CAC 40 led the gains, rising more than 1%. Italy's FTSE MIB also added over 1%. FTSE in London edged close to 1% higher. The pan-European stock 600 rose more than 0.5%. Frankfurt's DAX gained nearly 0.5%. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.